For about 5 weeks this summer, a huge chunk of the internet was convinced Iran's top general was dead. Then, on July 3rd, he walked into a funeral in Tehran in full uniform, standing a few feet from a coffin, and every single one of those reports turned out to be wrong. I want to use that specific episode as the way into this story because it tells you something. The simple America destroyed Iran's military brain framing tends to skip past entirely. So let's actually walk through what happened to Iran's top military leadership this year, who's confirmed dead, who's confirmed alive, and what the honest picture looks like once you sort the verified facts from the rumors. I pulled this together from CENTCOM statements, Reuters reporting built on sources close to the guards themselves, Wikipedia's sourced timeline of the war, and coverage from outlets that had reporters physically present at the events in question, specifically so I could tell you which parts of this story are actually confirmed and which parts, even now, still aren't. I think that distinction matters more here than in almost any other part of this war, because as you're about to see, even trained regional journalists spent weeks getting a basic fact about this specific command structure wrong. Let's go back to where this started, because the scale of what happened on day one of this war is honestly still hard to fully process even months later. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a joint operation, Epic Fury on the American side and Roaring Lion on the Israeli side, and the opening wave wasn't primarily about tanks or missile batteries sitting in a field somewhere. It was aimed squarely at leadership, command, and control. The actual decision-making apparatus that runs Iran's armed forces day to day. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in that opening strike on his compound in Tehran. He'd held that position, and with it, formal command of Iran's entire military for 36 years. The strike also killed his daughter, his son-in-law, his granddaughter, and notably, the wife of his son and eventual successor, Mojtaba. Mojtaba himself was reportedly wounded in the same attack. Beyond the family, Major General Mohammad Bagheri, the chief of staff of Iran's entire armed forces, the officer who sat at the very top of the general staff and coordinated between the regular military and the IRGC, was killed as well. So was Mohammad Pakpour, who had only been commander of the IRGC itself since the previous June, following the 12-day war. Iran's defense minister, Aziz Nasirzadeh, was killed too, along with Ali Shamkhani, a longtime deeply influential senior advisor to Khamenei. That's the supreme leader, the chief of staff of the entire armed forces, the IRGC commander, and the defense minister, all gone within the same 24-hour window, alongside a chunk of the supreme leader's own immediate family. There's a detail buried in the institutional record that I think captures the scale of this better than any casualty count could. The position of chief of staff of Iran's general staff, the most senior uniformed post in the entire country below the supreme leader, a position that's existed continuously since 1988, has simply been listed as vacant since February 28th. Not quietly refilled days later the way you'd expect from a country actively at war. Vacant, according to the available institutional record. For going on 5 months now. For comparison, that post has been continuously occupied by a named officer for basically the entire history of the position since its creation. Right up until this specific war broke that continuity for the first time on record, which gives you a sense of just how unprecedented this specific gap actually is, even by the standards of a country that's weathered plenty of military and political turmoil over the decades since 1979. The physical infrastructure took the same treatment as the personnel. Days into the war, CENTCOM confirmed it had struck and destroyed the headquarters of the IRGC itself, describing the strike, in its own public language, as cutting off the head of the snake. Israeli forces separately reported hitting dozens of additional command centers, including the IRGC's intelligence headquarters, its aerospace force command center, which runs Iran's missile and drone operations, and its internal security headquarters, with Israeli officials saying these strikes killed personnel inside and dealt a severe blow to Iran's ability to coordinate at a national level. By the 10-day mark, CENTCOM's own count had climbed past 5,000 targets struck nationwide, a tempo of roughly 500 targets a day sustained across an entire country, which tells you the underlying theory of the operation really was about speed, hitting the leadership and its infrastructure so comprehensively that there'd be no time for an orderly transition in between. It's worth pausing here, because this isn't the first time the US or Israel has tried exactly this kind of leadership decapitation against Iran's military establishment, and the history is directly relevant to reading what's happened since February. Back in January of 2020, a single American strike killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC's Quds force and arguably the single most important figure in Iran's entire regional strategy at the time. The man who'd spent 2 decades personally building relationships with militias and allied groups across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Soleimani was succeeded by Esmail Qani, who inherited that entire external network built on Soleimani's own personal relationships. And the open question analysts asked for years afterward was whether a successor could actually hold that kind of informal relationship-based network together without the same decades of personal trust behind it. This time, the US and Israel didn't just remove one figure at the top of one branch, they went after the supreme leader, the chief of staff, the IRGC commander, and the defense minister simultaneously, a fundamentally larger version of the same strategic bet that removing enough of the human relationships holding a command structure together will functionally break the structure itself, even if the org chart on paper gets refilled within days. 5 months in, with Vahidi confirmed alive and apparently running much of the actual day-to-day war effort, that bet looks like it produced a similar outcome to 2020. Real disruption, a genuinely weakened network, but not the kind of permanent collapse the strike's architects were presumably hoping for. Now here's the part of the story that I think deserves far more attention than it's gotten, because Iran didn't just sit there and lose its head with no plan for what comes next. According to Reuters reporting built on sources close to the guards themselves, the IRGC had actually anticipated exactly this kind of decapitation strike well before it happened, and had built a resilience plan specifically around it. Multiple sources described a system where every senior figure in the command structure had named successors 3 ranks deep, meaning if a commander was killed, there wasn't just one backup, there were 3, already briefed and positioned to step in without waiting on orders from a shattered central hierarchy. A deputy defense minister more or less confirmed this strategy publicly on Iranian television not long after the war began. That plan is a big part of why Iran's military didn't simply collapse into chaos after February 28th. That plan is a big part of why Iran's military didn't simply collapse into chaos after February 28th. There's also a deeper layer to this resilience architecture that specialist defense analysis sources have documented, something beyond just naming backup commanders. If a corps commander gets killed, the IRGC's structure calls for a political officer, an ideological and administrative counterpart embedded alongside every military commander to keep reporting directly up to the supreme leader's office and to serve as a coordination point while a military successor gets slotted in. That network also does something less obvious, but arguably just as important during a crisis like this one. It maintains the ideological indoctrination system that keeps rank-and-file personnel committed to the fight, even when the officers who recruited and trained them are suddenly gone. Function analysts studying the structure say matters more precisely during moments of crisis than during ordinary peacetime, when routine and material incentives alone are usually enough to hold a military together. Iran's own recent experience with a smaller ally offers a useful preview of exactly this kind of reconstitution, playing out in real time. After Israel killed Hezbollah's longtime leader Hassan Nasrallah and a string of other senior commanders back in 2024, the IRGC didn't let the group limp along with a hollowed-out command structure. Reuters reporting, based on sources familiar with the effort, describes IRGC officers stepping directly into the gaps, plugging Iranian personnel into Hezbollah's chain of command temporarily, and rebuilding the group's internal structure from the ground up, specifically to close the intelligence vulnerabilities that had let Israel find and kill so many of its leaders in the first place. That overhaul paid off enough that Hezbollah re-entered the fight on Tehran's side once this current war broke out, firing hundreds of missiles into Israel. So the IRGC had already run a live trial of rebuilding a decapitated command structure once before, on a smaller ally, well before it had to run the exact same playbook on itself. Within about a week, an interim leadership council took over on a temporary basis, made up of Ali Larijani, President Masoud Pezeshkian, and Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei. Then, on March 8th, Mojtaba Khamenei was formally elected the new supreme leader by Iran's Assembly of Experts, a figure widely described by analysts, including a report from the Atlantic Council, as considerably more hardline and more closely tied to the IRGC than his father ever was. Leading the IRGC itself was Ahmad Vahidi, who'd actually already been named deputy commander of the guards by the elder Khamenei back in December, before the war even started, and who stepped fully into the top role after Pakpour's death on February 28th. This is where that opening story comes back around. Vahidi is a genuinely significant figure in Iran's modern military history well beyond this war. He was the first ever commander of the IRGC's Quds Force back in the late 1980s, the unit responsible for building Iran's entire network of regional proxy relationships, a post he held until 1997, when he handed it off to a young officer named Qasem Soleimani, who ran it until his own assassination in a drone strike in January 2020. Vahidi later served as Iran's defense minister and, separately, as its interior minister, and he's carried US office, EU, and Canadian sanctions for years, tied in part to accusations connecting him to the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. So when he stepped into the IRGC's top job in March, it wasn't some obscure functionary getting promoted by default. It was one of the most experienced, most ideologically hardline figures and the entire Iranian security establishment taking direct control of the organization at the center of the war. And then, in early June, the rumors started. On June 8th, Israeli-linked social media accounts began circulating claims that Vahidi had been killed in an overnight strike on an underground facility near Kosar Park in northwest Tehran, reportedly after he'd issued a fresh public threat against Israel the day before. The claim spread fast, stamped with the word "eliminated" over his photograph, picked up by regional outlets across the Gulf and Israel. And for days, nobody could actually confirm it either way. Iranian state media said nothing. The IRGC said nothing. Israeli officials didn't comment. Multiple outlets covering the story at the time were explicit that this was entirely unconfirmed, some even noting the claims might stem from confused reporting, mixing Vahidi up with an unrelated individual involved in satellite contracts who was targeted in a separate strike weeks earlier, a mix-up that itself tells you something about how thin the actual verification chain was at every stage of this rumor's spread. It's worth noting, this wasn't even the first time death rumors had attached themselves to Vahidi specifically. A separate round of speculation had already circulated on May 31st, tied to that same Andeshe suburb strike on the individual with the similar-sounding name, and Iranian sources at the time didn't confirm any assassination, with some suggesting the damage shown in circulating footage might have come from something as mundane as a gas explosion rather than a targeted strike at all. So by the time the June 8th rumors hit, there was already a track record of Vahidi-adjacent death claims turning out to be either premature, mistaken, or entirely unrelated to him. And yet the June round still spread with roughly the same level of unearned confidence as if it were freshly confirmed fact. The rumor sat there, unresolved, for nearly a month. Then, on July 3rd, Vahidi appeared in public for the first time since the war had begun at the farewell ceremony for the body of the supreme leader he'd once served under, standing near Khamenei's coffin in Tehran, ahead of the multi-day funeral processions that would eventually carry the body to Tehran, Qom, Najaf, Karbala, and finally Mashhad for burial on July 9th. Al Jazeera's correspondent on the ground in Tehran documented and shared the images directly. Iranian media described his appearance as a ceremony held to renew allegiance to the ideals of the revolution. Whatever the framing, the basic fact was unmistakable. The man half the internet had been calling dead for a month was standing upright at a state funeral in full uniform. I want to sit with why that matters beyond just correcting one specific rumor, because I think it says something real about how hard this entire story is to track accurately from the outside. If a detail as basic as whether the head of Iran's most powerful military institution is alive or dead can stay genuinely unresolved for a full month, cascading across dozens of outlets, some of them serious regional publications, that tells you the information environment around Iran's actual chain of command right now is murkier than almost any other part of this war. Reporting on Iran tends to get treated with the same confidence as reporting on, say, a conventional military's order of battle, when the reality is that a huge amount of what circulates about Iran's internal leadership, especially anything sourced to opposition channels or unnamed social media accounts, simply cannot be verified in anything close to real time. The Institute for the Study of War has separately noted that Vahidi and his inner circle now effectively dominate Iran's political and military decision-making, describing his faction as having sidelined more moderate civilian officials and pushed a hardline stance against compromise with the United States, which, notably, is a very different read on his influence than a month of "he's already dead" headlines would have suggested. It's worth naming exactly why verification is this hard specifically for Iran's internal leadership, rather than just noting that it is. Iran doesn't allow the kind of independent press access inside its senior military and political circles that would let outside journalists directly confirm a figure's status the way you might in a more open society. State media only speaks when the government decides speaking serves its interests, and staying silent on a rumor, even a false one, can sometimes suit the government just as well as denying it outright, since ambiguity about who's actually alive and in charge can function as its own form of operational security against an adversary trying to target the next name on the list. That structural opacity is exactly what let a month-long, entirely false rumor about one of the most consequential men in the country spread as far as it did before a single set of funeral photographs finally settled the question. There's a second confirmed absence sitting right alongside that resolved one, and this one hasn't been cleared up nearly as neatly. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader himself, still has not made a full public appearance since his father was killed and he himself was reportedly wounded on February 28th. When his father's days-long state funeral began in early July with delegations from Russia, China, Iraq, and other allied governments in attendance, Mojtaba was nowhere to be seen. Iranian television did show 3 of his brothers, Mustafa, Maysam, and Masoud, praying behind the coffins. The new supreme leader himself never appeared. One mourner interviewed by Al Jazeera at the ceremony described her continued belief in his leadership in almost explicitly religious terms, comparing it to faith in something you don't see but choose to believe in anyway, which is a genuinely striking thing for an ordinary citizen to say about a sitting head of state on the record to a foreign news crew. So here's where the actual chain of command sits today, as best as the verified record allows us to reconstruct it. Iran has a supreme leader who has functionally never appeared in public in his own role. It has an IRGC commander who is very much alive, confirmed by direct video documentation, and who, by multiple analysts' accounts, may currently hold more real, functioning authority over the war than the supreme leader he technically answers to. It has a chief of staff position at the top of its general staff that has sat vacant for 5 months. And it has an interim leadership structure, Larijani, Pezeshkian, and the judiciary chief that was only ever meant to be temporary back in early March, now still apparently operating in some capacity alongside Mojtaba's formal, mostly invisible leadership. That's a genuinely unusual structure for any country to be running an active war under, let alone one facing the kind of external pressure Iran is currently facing on multiple fronts at once. In a typical wartime chain of command, ambiguity at the very top tends to get resolved quickly, either through a clear formal succession or through one figure visibly consolidating power in practice, because the alternative, extended uncertainty about who's actually authorized to make final calls, creates real risk of miscommunication or conflicting orders during exactly the moments when a fast, coordinated response matters most. Iran appears to be operating with exactly that kind of extended uncertainty 5 months into an active war. And the fact that it's still functioning as a fighting force despite that uncertainty says something notable about the depth of the institutional bench beneath the very top, even as it raises real questions about how sustainable that arrangement is if the war keeps dragging on. It's worth pausing on the legal and ethical debate running underneath the entire decapitation strategy too, because it hasn't gone away just because the war has dragged on for months. Leadership decapitation strikes, especially ones that kill a sitting head of state, sit in a genuinely contested space under international law. Some European officials, including Norway's foreign minister, said explicitly and early on that preventive strikes like the ones that opened this war don't meet the legal bar international law sets, which requires an actual imminent threat rather than a longer-term strategic concern about weapons development or regional influence. Legal scholars have made similar arguments about targeting a head of state directly, arguing that regime decapitation of this kind blurs the line between a military operation and something closer to a targeted assassination campaign against a government's entire leadership structure at once. Other voices, including American officials and a meaningful share of Iran's own domestic opposition, have argued the opposite, that removing a leadership responsible for both an accelerating nuclear program and years of proxy warfare across the region was not just legally defensible, but overdue. I'm not going to pretend that debate is settled, because it isn't. And it's exactly the kind of question serious legal scholars are still actively arguing about in real time, without a clean, unanimous answer. Let me give you my actual read on all of this, because I think the obliterated framing in a title like this one is both true and seriously incomplete. And those two things can sit next to each other without contradicting. It is absolutely true that the United States and Israel executed one of the most thorough command decapitation campaigns against a modern military in decades, killing a sitting head of state who also served as commander-in-chief, his chief of staff, his IRGC commander, and his defense minister, all within a single day, while also physically destroying the IRGC's own headquarters and multiple additional command centers, is not a symbolic achievement. That's a real structural blow to how a country runs its military, and I don't think it gets nearly enough credit as pure operational execution, regardless of how anyone feels about the decision to launch the war. If you'd asked a defense analyst 5 years ago whether a single day of strikes could remove a supreme leader, an armed forces chief of staff, an IRGC commander, and a defense minister all at once, most would have called that an almost impossibly ambitious target list, and the fact that it happened at all is genuinely remarkable from a pure execution standpoint. But obliterated implies something switched off and stayed off, and what the actual verified record shows 5 months later looks more like something that got forcibly rewired instead. Because Iran had pre-positioned successors 3 ranks deep, and because a figure as experienced and ideologically committed as Ahmad Vahidi was already sitting one step from the top job when the war began, the brain didn't simply go dark. It reorganized around a smaller, more hardline core, one that a month of confident he's dead reporting couldn't even accurately track in real time, let alone predict or disrupt further. That's arguably a more dangerous outcome from a security standpoint than a clean kill would have been, not a less dangerous one, because a hardline, battle-hardened veteran who survived the war's opening weeks and then survived a month of assassination rumors on top of that isn't an obviously easier actor to negotiate with or deter going forward. A negotiating partner with one clear, visible voice at the top, even a hostile one, is generally easier to reach a durable agreement with than a structure this opaque. where even journalists and regional analysts spent a full month unable to determine whether the man actually running the war was alive. It's also worth remembering that whatever the strategic verdict on this campaign eventually turns out to be, it's unfolding against a country already buckling under enormous strain from other directions entirely, which makes the leadership question even harder to cleanly separate from everything else happening inside Iran right now. A government trying to manage a currency in freefall, a domestic protest crackdown that killed thousands of its own citizens just weeks before this war even began, and now a chain of command with a 5-month vacancy at its most senior uniformed post, is not managing any one of those crises in isolation. Each one compounds the others, and a security establishment already stretched thin trying to fight an active war has correspondingly less institutional bandwidth left over to manage a fracturing economy or a population that's already lost significant faith in the government's basic competence. I also think it's worth sitting briefly with the human scale of this, separate from the strategic framing entirely. We're talking about a head of state, his own daughter, son-in-law and granddaughter, his son's wife, a defense minister, a chief of staff of an entire armed forces, and dozens of senior officers with decades of service between them, wiped from a single family and a single chain of command within one war. Whatever you think about the justification for this operation, and there's genuine ongoing disagreement about that even among American allies, that's an extraordinary loss of institutional continuity and personal history compressed into a matter of months, the kind of loss that doesn't show up cleanly in any target count or damage assessment. So if you're asking me directly whether Iran's military brain actually got obliterated, here's the most honest answer the verified record supports. The specific people running it in February are, with the singular and now well-documented exception of Ahmad Vahidi, dead. The physical buildings that housed a large share of its command function are damaged or destroyed, but the function itself, the actual ability to issue orders, coordinate strikes, and keep fighting, clearly survived because Iran has kept launching coordinated attacks against multiple countries, basically every week since, right through this month's exchanges over the Strait of Hormuz. What got obliterated was a specific leadership generation. What replaced it is smaller, harder to verify from the outside, arguably more ideologically hardline, and based on 5 months of watching rumors about it collapse and then get overturned by a single set of funeral photographs, considerably harder for anyone, including apparently half of the people covering this war in real time, to accurately track than the obliterated framing lets on. I'll keep following this specific thread, especially whatever eventually happens with Mojtaba Khamenei's continued public absence. Because if a supreme leader can go this long without a confirmed, unambiguous public appearance in his own name, that's arguably a bigger open question about who's actually running Iran's war right now than anything happening on any single battlefield. Wars like this one rarely announce their real turning points clearly while they're happening. They usually only become obvious in hindsight. And I'd rather flag a pattern like this one now, while it's still forming and still genuinely uncertain, than wait for some retrospective account to connect the dots years from now once all the official records eventually get released or declassified. If breakdowns like this, the kind that actually go back and check who's confirmed alive and who isn't, instead of repeating whatever a stamped photo on social media claims, are why you keep coming back here. Go ahead and subscribe with notifications on, because this specific story has already proven it can flip in a single afternoon, and I don't want you finding out a month late, the way half the internet did with Vahidi. I'd genuinely rather you get the slower, more carefully sourced version a few days after the fact than a viral, unverified one the moment it starts trending. And I want your take on this one. Does a hardline survivor like Vahidi, someone who outlasted both his predecessors and a month of his own death being reported as fact, make Iran's military leadership more predictable going forward, or less? And what do you make of a supreme leader who still hasn't shown his face nearly 5 months into holding the job? Tell me what you think in the comments, and let me know which thread of this story, the succession question, the reconstitution of the IRGC, or something else entirely you want unpacked next, because each one of those threads genuinely has enough verified material behind it for its own full breakdown. That's where I'll leave this one. See you in the next video.